Hi, good evening, and welcome to the latest in one of Unboxed's webinars. The topic tonight is Offshoring Agile, making it work in practice. My name is Carlo Kruger, and I run the Cape Town office of Unboxed. For those of you that are into the Twitters, the hashtag for the webinar tonight is Offshoring Agile. And I hope to see some of those comments come through. So, how do we do this right? I believe that we've reached the era of peak talent some years ago, kind of like peak oil, but for talent. There's always been a greater demand for software development than the available supply, I think, from the get-go. And this has only gotten more extreme recently. In particular, the increased number of options available for talented developers has meant that the competition for these scarce resources has resulted in a global market where attracting and retaining these people has become a lot harder. Large corporations in particular have been hard hit, and geeks are deathly allergic to the bureaucracy that is endemic in large organizations. As a result, it is especially difficult for these companies to attract skilled developers. So I think we're now moving into a time where more and more development work will be outsourced and offshored. And to do this effectively while remaining agile can be hard. Offshoring seems to be, by its nature, require the kind of handoffs we traditionally associate with waterfall projects. And this can be magnified where the decision to offshore is driven by a cost-driven mindset. Those of you that have been following the conversation around how we work as Unboxed will have seen that we have a model of working with our customers, but we make very clear upfront that doing this for cost-based reasons is perhaps not the right mindset to come to the relationship. It's, I think, driven by this idea that knowledge work can be commoditized. And I think the last time I truly lost my temper with someone was due to their persistent use of the word software factory to refer to the people responsible for bringing their digital product to market. In my view, the complexity of software development means that the economies of scale that make things a commodity just don't apply to software development. But there are significant challenges to doing agile at a distance. It seems like pretty much from the get-go, when I started working in IT over 15 years ago, that first as a project manager and then as a scrum master and later as an agile coach, I've been involved with working with teams that were distributed or working in an outsourced model. And so I gained some fairly painful lessons along the way, and I hope that today I can help others learn from my mistakes over the years. The three topics I hope to cover today with respect to doing agile in an offshoring model are communication, culture, and trust. So starting with communication, it's right there in the Agile Manifesto in it. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And as an Agile coach, I've always preferred low-tech solutions in terms of communication. Index cards, post-it notes, physical task boards. And the reason that I always use those things is that it enhances the probability of face-to-face communication happening within a team between the product owner and a developer and so on. And so while time and technology have marched on, we remain at our core the same hairless apes. We've evolved to communicate through spoken word and gesture. But there are so many other options available to us out there through technology. But one of the very important lessons I learned early on is about the continuum of medium richness, which runs from text documents, which are asynchronous and the least rich because they lack, they make assumptions about context. And that runs all the way through to the most rich, which is face-to-face communication. It's vital that everybody in an offshoring team on both sides of that divide understands this continuum. It's also vital that when misunderstandings happen or there is tension, that you understand the necessity for escalating the medium richness. If you're having an email conversation and tempers are flaring, rather than sending that email, have a phone call or a video conference. The other aspect that you need to take into consideration in terms of the nature of the medium is whether it's synchronous versus asynchronous. Sometimes when things are not urgent or you don't want to interrupt someone, an asynchronous medium like email or instant message is preferable. The problem comes in when your expectations about response are not met by the medium. For example, when you treat instant message as a synchronous medium, there can be a sense of frustration if someone is not responding to your requests or your communications. And that's probably because they're not physically present in front of their computer at the time that you're sending out that message. And you can't see that. And you try to the natural thing there is that your expectations about the medium and the medium's ability to deliver are not aligned. Interestingly enough, in our office at the moment, we have a number of remote workers. And what we've done is we've designated someone that we call the pimp hand. So the person who's responsible for being there for those people who are not physically present in the office to be able to have some kind of physical extension to go and poke someone to say, please answer your instant message or similarly. The other thing I wanted to get into around communication in an offshore team revolves around two critical biases that we have which affect non-face-to-face communication. This goes back to my point earlier about us still just being hairless monkeys, really. The first is that there is a measurable bias inherent in all online communications. Neutral statements are generally interpreted as negative. In fact, there's a plugin that's been written for email clients called tonecheck.com, which you can go and check out, that helps people identify when they're using neutral language and help them to rewrite it as positive statements. It even goes so far as to say that we should be consciously making use of things like emoji to express feelings in online communications. And so while in a professional context that might seem a little weird, it plays an incredibly valuable role in communicating emotional content, which is otherwise missing from the medium. And in that way, it replaces tone and gesture in a very economical way. The other bias, I did some research recently around cognitive biases as part of a user experience presentation that I gave at a conference. And the one that really, really stood out for me is this thing called fundamental attribution error. What that means is that we have a cognitive bias towards attributing people's behavior as being motivated by their internal motivations rather than a product of the environment. So, for example, if you see someone driving badly, perhaps very fast or weaving around the road, you automatically assume that they're inconsiderate or a bad driver or perhaps drunk. And that's a very, very natural aspect of our cognitive behavior in that we want to attribute agency to those actions. When in fact, a very good friend of mine's mom suffered from diabetes. And one time she was driving erratically. She got stopped by a policeman. And luckily for her, he recognized that she was experiencing hypoglycemic shock. There have been tales of people that have found themselves in similar situations where police have treated them much more harshly and violently as a result. So we have a tendency to interpret other people's behavior as malign, and this tendency is hardwired into our brains. Daniel Kahnemeyer has written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he discusses just how difficult it is to cope with these inherent cognitive biases, and I recommend it as a great book to read. The really troubling thing about fundamental attribution error and all cognitive biases is that the mere awareness of the existence of the bias is insufficient to confer immunity to it. So it still requires a great deal of effort on the part of the person who sees some kind of behavior happening to this behavior being exhibited by someone they work with remotely. It requires a great deal of effort to stop and question your assumptions about the motivations of others, and really being open to those conversations. There's also another critical challenge we face when working remotely with others, and it seems like a really trivial thing, but it plays such an important role in building relationships. And really, what we struggle with is how do we build relationships effectively with people that we don't have face-to-face contact with? And the thing that we lose, in fact, the first thing that we lose is we lose the opportunity for small talk. There's a tendency in remote communications to get straight to business, and this results in seeing the person on the other end of that call as less than a complete human being, someone with moods and habits, a lifestyle outside work, and so on. And it leads to a lack of empathy and invariably a more contentious frame for any kind of negotiations you might be experiencing. So, given all the gloomy news I've given above, what do we do and what can you do to enhance and improve your communication? And I know that earlier I said that Agile Manifesto and tooling and so on, that the first thing I wanted to talk about is tooling. And the biggest and most important thing that I have to say there is buy the best quality bandwidth you can afford. An ex-colleague of mine working in Canada ran some experiments. He had a number of teams working across Canada. And he found that at a minimum, both sides of the conversation need approximately 30 megabits per second to enable true real-time communication. Anything less than this, and there is a noticeable lag between the speaker's start of a word and when that word is heard by the other party. More importantly, there's a lag when you finish a statement and when that is heard. And this is the reason why there are so many stop-starts in a typical Skype conversation, for example. It's why people end up talking over each other, and it can be incredibly frustrating for all parties involved. So video conferencing does go some way towards alleviating this problem. In our offices, we've recently upgraded our bandwidth, and video conferencing has become more commonplace than what it had been in the past. I feel that based on observations, that it's had a fairly big impact on clarity of communications. It's much easier to tell when someone would like to say something when another party is busy dominating the conversation, because you can literally see them going turning red, shaking fists and stuff. We've also been working really, really hard at getting remote pairing to work with developers. So our teams are generally distributed around South Africa and around London and the UK. So I think that getting that right has been a challenge for us, but there are more and more tools available to make that easy. And this is especially this idea of pairing becomes very important when we start to talk about the next topic that is part of this communication thing, which is about team composition. Early in my career, I had the experience of working with a Dutch company while we were in South Africa. And the setup of the outsourcing team was that the business and systems analyst team worked on site with the customer in the Netherlands, and they communicated with the development team, all based in South Africa, primarily through the use of artifacts, Jira tickets, and a tool by Spark Systems called Enterprise Architect, so producing diagrams such as use cases and UML models. Now, the project was not an outright failure, but it was a death march, and it came in significantly over budget. And while there were many reasons for this, one of the key things that stands out for me looking back was the creation of this handoff point which followed from the team structure. By segregating teams based on function, the opportunity for true collaboration was severely stunted. As a result of that experience, I think teams work best when there is a mix of skills in all locations. Some people in the Agile community have referred to this practice as mirror teams. In practice, what it means is that when we work together with our London-based team, we try to make sure that there are, for example, front-end, back-end, and design happening on both sides of the Atlantic. So this kind of forces the front-enders, for example, to work closely with each other and understand how things work, and they become a conduit for that information to the back-end team. So it forces relationships, and it helps communication on both sides, and it contributes to this shared understanding in both locations. The next part of this is a little bit contentious, but it can also significantly alter the power dynamics within a team, within a larger team, when, for example, all the testing is done in one location. Now, as is the case already, testers seem to have a kind of second-class citizenship, low self-esteem, and then having them all working on a single site will just make that much worse. To be blunt, there's an inevitable colonial feel to wealthy first world companies outsourcing work to less well-off countries in the third world, and even to emerging markets like the old Eastern Bloc countries. And in my experience, this is felt most strongly by the previously colonized, and not so much by the old colonial powers. In this case, the agile principle of having a team composed of all of the skills needed to deliver needs to go a bit further to ensure that those skills are spread geographically also, so as to remove this idea of for example, requirements moving from the first world to the third world where it gets implemented. So coming back to the tooling discussion, we've recently moved to using Slack, and it's played a pretty valuable role in distributed teams. What I really, really like about it is that it has a persistent record of a conversation, and it makes it really valuable in terms of retaining some level of organizational memory around decisions made. Slack also seems to, well, maybe this is just our team, but it seems to enhance the small talk across the distance. Maybe it's just the presence of the hash random channel that does this. I don't know. In any event, a tool like Slack, which is more open and inclusive than email, makes for a better channel for communication around the decisions and the projects that you're working on. And then lastly, I'd like to recommend you purchase high quality microphones and cameras. Microphones in particular can make meetings which have multiple parties in one room much more clear and easy to hear. We use the Blue Snowball from Blue Microphones, which looks like that. But any similar big piece of kit will make a massive difference in voice quality. And there's just one last thing I wanted to mention before I move onto culture, and that is facilitation. Facilitation of meetings where some parties are remote is vitally important, and a place where the Scrum Master role really comes into their own. So firstly, know that having a conversation with someone who is not in the room is much more cognitively taxing than the equivalent conversation with someone physically present. It's one of the reasons why we've banned the use of mobile phones in cars. As a result, it's important that you bear in mind when setting up meetings, where meetings must run longer for 45 minutes, so for example, sprint plannings or kickoff meetings, ensure that you take frequent breaks, and possibly even consider breaking the meeting into a series of shorter meetings if possible, making sure that people are prepared for the meeting. And it's very, very important that the conversation doesn't treat the remote team as passive listeners. The design of the meeting must take care to invite participation from both sides. So use live online tools like Trello or Web Whiteboard. I've even used Google's presentation or drawing tools in the past to create dynamic online artifacts so that people can know when you're referring to something during a discussion. Things like stickies can move into the digital realm when conducting a remote retrospective, for example. So we've used Trello very, very successfully as a kind of virtual whiteboard with columns of what didn't go so well, what went well, what would we like to do differently would be the columns, and then each of the cards which go into that, you can clearly see that being like the sticky on a whiteboard. And it offers the opportunity to do things like it's got built-in voting. I'm a big fan of Trello. Other normal meeting etiquette is also still important, so make sure you have an agenda, that you stick to your time box, that you start promptly, and you have a clear and agreed outcome. So when facilitating remote meetings, I tend to be fairly aggressive in sending discussions to the parking lot. That means moving things which are important, but not necessarily the theme of the meeting, to a parking lot of ideas for later discussion. So let's move on to culture. I'm just going to have a quick drink. The reason why cats and dogs generally don't get along all that well is down to their tail language. Both species use their tails for communication, except they profoundly misread each other. When cats are excited, they stick their tails straight up in the air, sometimes quivering from side to side, and when cats are upset, they flip their tails from side to side. Now, dogs, on the other hand, when they're aroused, their tails are straight up in the air, and when they're excited, they wag their tails from side to side. So you can probably figure out from this that there's a reason why cats and dogs misread each other completely, and that's why they don't get along. And you're wondering what this has to do with culture. Well, I experienced something very similar to this when I lived in the States for 2.5 years. I used to rent from this real hippie landlord in Seattle, and when I'd go to give him the rent check, he'd be in his art studio, and he'd invariably ask me what I thought about his latest paintings. Now, to explain, he was going through a phase where he was painting blindfolded. So I would try and find something positive to say, like, I really like the colors in this one, or something along those lines. And one day, while I was handing over the rent and checking out his latest paintings, a friend of his arrived, and he asked him the same question, and the response was, effusive, wildly enthusiastic. "Wow, this is the greatest thing ever! This is the best you've done so far." And I realized that we were divided by a common language. And this is a context where the shared language was our first language when dealing across major cultural boundaries which do not share a first language. The effect can be even more pronounced. India for example, has a strongly paternalistic culture, and in practice this means that it's considered very rude to disagree publicly with an authority figure. And how this plays out in software development has proven to be disastrous if this cultural tendency is not well understood. I've had many people talk about their experience of working with Indian development teams where it seems to them that the team is actually agreeing that they're going to implement this feature, when in fact what they're actually saying is they agree that they understand what you've asked for, but they probably also understand that it's impossible to implement, but they have no way of communicating this because the customer is usually in the position of an authority figure. So I have one piece of advice that hopefully can help you bridge the cultural gap. Be prepared to spend money on airfare. Within Unbox, for example, we have a program where our permanent employees are encouraged to spend time in other branch offices. And we do this specifically to encourage learning and cultural transmission. It helps to build relationships across the offices so that we can work together, and there's a shared way of working and strong relationships to build on. Similarly, I would encourage you to travel to meet the development team in their environment, and for the team to travel to see how the customer works. There's really no substitute for in-person discussions. And most importantly, make a point of having a meal together. I cannot stress the vital role food plays. It's a way to create those opportunities to speak about the work informally, and goes a long way towards creating those vital relationships. And it looks to me like I don't know if I'm going to have time to cover much in the way of trust. So I'm going to skip ahead to some of the strategies that I've used there. The chief one for me is really around the nature of expectation management. In software development, there are always going to be the unknown unknowns, and they are the ones that are going to get you every time. The strategy I use to create trust is one I lifted from Kent Beck in his book Extreme Programming Explained. He says, in his view, and it's really one I share, it's not the role of the vendor to manage expectations. The role of the vendor is to be as open and as transparent as possible about progress. And it's the role of the customer to use this information to manage their own expectations. Expectation management feels to me too close to spin doctrine. It's the selective release of information to create the outcome you're looking for. This feels like the opposite of openness and trust building. And the other thing I got from an American chef, Tom Colicchio, which he calls the 3 A's. There are always going to be times when things go wrong. It's impossible to prevent mistakes from happening. So the 3 A's are acknowledge that you made a mistake, apologize, and then act on it. So that's all I've got to say about Agile offshoring. The hashtag is Agile Offshoring. And if you have any questions, please post them into the chat room.